The Degrees of Knowledge by Jacques Maritain. Appendix 3. What is God? When we say that we know something exists but not its essence, we mean that we can answer the question of whether it exists but not what it is. This follows the teachings of Aristotle, who called this type of knowledge knowing that in his posterior analytics. Therefore, the knowledge of existence is affirmed, while the knowledge of essence is denied by the Thomists. We do not have knowledge of the essence, but we do have knowledge of existence.
To know what something is to know how to define it by its essential predicates, and to understand the reason for its properties. Thus, the question of what is it and why is it are essentially the same, although they differ in reasoning. Knowing what something is and knowing the cause of its existence are the same. The speculative sciences are not about the essences of separate substances because we cannot know their essence through demonstrative sciences. These essences are intelligible by themselves to an intellect proportionate to them. However, through speculative sciences, we can know whether they exist, what they are not, and something about them by analogy to things found in lower beings. Knowing what something is consists in understanding its essence or nature. This is different from simply knowing that it exists. For example, knowing the essence of a lion means understanding all its essential predicates. Only someone who knows all these predicates up to the ultimate difference knows the lion's essence. Similarly, only someone who sees the divine essence knows God in this way. However, knowing that God exists, as St. Thomas knew, means understanding the meaning of his name and acknowledging the vastness of knowledge that attains the divine nature without seeing it. Our knowledge of God does not go beyond knowing that he exists. While this knowledge does not surpass knowing that he exists, it still provides a way to understand what God is, albeit imperfectly. This includes our metaphysical knowledge of God, the angel's natural knowledge of God, the supernatural knowledge through faith, and the knowledge through infused contemplation, which is the peak of knowledge through faith. Since our intellect is related to forms abstracted from the senses, we cannot know God in this state through his essence. Instead, we know him through his effects. There are two types of effects: those that match the power of their cause and those that do not. Through the former, we can fully understand the cause's power and essence. Through the latter, we can only know that the cause exists. All effects of God fall into the latter category, so we can only know that he exists. However, those who know that he exists can know him more perfectly, depending on how well they understand the relationship between cause and effect. The human mind progresses in the knowledge of God in three ways: by understanding the effect's progression from the cause, by recognizing the effect's similarity to the cause, and by acknowledging the effect's deficiency compared to the cause. This progress is aided by the natural light of the mind being strengthened by new illumination, such as the light of faith, and the gift of wisdom and understanding. This elevates the mind in contemplation, recognizing that God is beyond all natural apprehension. However, since we cannot penetrate his essence, it is said that the mind is reflected back by the excellent light. As Gregory comments on Genesis 32, I saw the Lord face to face. St. Thomas explains that to know what something is, the intellect must grasp its essence, either directly or through something that sufficiently demonstrates its essence. However, we cannot know the essence of God or immaterial substances through likeness, causality, natural knowledge, or revelation. We can only know that they exist if we have some knowledge of what they are. either perfectly or imperfectly. This imperfect knowledge occurs by understanding what these substances are not, and their relation of causality or eminence to sensible substances. The De Potentia contains detailed explanations of this point. Our intellect, informed by the perfections found in created things, understands God through these perfections. Whenever the intellect is assimilated to something through its intelligible form, what it conceives and enunciates is verified of the thing it resembles. Thus, what the intellect thinks or says about God, informed by these perfections, truly exists in God. However, if these intelligible forms perfectly match the divine essence, the intellect would comprehend it. Since they do not, the names we attribute to God signify his substance imperfectly. Therefore, the name He who is most fitting for God, as it signifies his indeterminate being.
This solution is confirmed by Dionysius, who says that the divinity, existing simply and infinitely in itself, is praised and named from various things. The perfections in creatures are attributed to God according to his simple essence. But no created perfection comprehends the divine essence. Thus, the intellect defines God under the aspect of that perfection. Names signifying the divine substance tell us in some manner what God is. Although we cannot know God as he is in himself on earth, we can know what God is in a more or less imperfect but true fashion. This can be achieved through metaphysics, faith, theology, and infused contemplation, which attain the deity veiled by created analogates. Translating, "We do not know God in any way," exposes the reader to misconceptions. Literal translations may appear exact but fail to convey the technical or didactic meaning of the original expression. Thus, in cases where the original expression has a technical or didactic meaning, which a word-by-word translation does not render, literal or quasi-literal translations may only appear to be exact. Does that justify an author who, recently coming across a French phrase which he was not able to recognize as a quasi-literal translation of a passage from the Summa contra Gentiles, taking scandal at it as if it were a heresy? However that may be, if we keep in mind St. Thomas's explicit explanation of the expression "Sire de aliquo, quid est," then the intellect is said to know what something is when it defines it. That is, when it conceives some form of the thing which corresponds to the thing itself in every way. Now, from what has been said, it is clear that whatever our intellect conceives about God falls short of representing him, and therefore what he is always remains hidden from us. We can see that the passage from the Summa contra Gentiles, we cannot grasp what God is, but what he is not, and how other things relate to him, is simply a summary of the doctrine St. Thomas constantly teaches in similar terms, wherever he treats of the divine names, in which we referred to above in respect to the commentary on the De Trinitate of Boethius. This teaching is admirably summarized in the Summa Theologia. We would like to draw attention to the fact here that in the second article, St. Thomas states, as he does in the text of the De Potentia, quoted above, that such names indeed signify the divine substance and are predicated of God substantially, but they fall short of representing him. They signify the divine substance, yet imperfectly, just as creatures represent him imperfectly. Therefore, when it is said that God is good, it does not mean that God is the cause of goodness, or that God is not evil, but it means that what we call goodness in creatures pre-exists in God, and this in a higher way. In the Ad 1, he explains further. Damascene therefore says that these names do not signify what God is, because none of these names express what he is perfectly. but each one signifies him imperfectly, just as creatures represent him imperfectly. And in the ad 3, we cannot know the essence of God in this life as it is in itself, but we know it as it is represented in the perfections of creatures. As we can know the nature of a thing from its properties and effects, so we can signify it by a name. Hence, because we can know the substance of a stone from its property according to itself, knowing what a stone is, this name stone signifies the nature of the stone as it is in itself, for it signifies the definition of the stone, by which we know what a stone is. For the concept which the name signifies is the definition, as it is said in IV Metaph. But from the divine effects we cannot know the divine nature as it is in itself, so as to know what it is, but by way of eminence and causality, and negation, as was said above. And so this name God signifies the divine nature. For this name was imposed to signify something existing above all things, which is the principle of all things, and removed from all things. Such texts say everything that is to be said, and while noting the technical meaning of scire de aliquo quid est, they show clearly that according to St. Thomas, although we cannot know the essence of God as it is in itself, nevertheless we do know it, although in an imperfect way. Finally, let us reread the 2 following texts from the De Potentia and the Summa Theologiae, to the objection whether in God's substance or essence is the same as being, and it seems that it is not. For Damascene says, in Ilib, Orth, Fide, since it is manifest to us that God exists, but what he is according to substance and nature is altogether incomprehensible and unknown. But it cannot be the same thing known and unknown. Therefore the being of God is not the same as his substance or essence. St. Thomas answers, to the first, therefore, it must be said that being and existence are said in 2 ways, as is clear in metaphysics. For sometimes it signifies the essence of a thing, or the act of being. Sometimes it signifies the truth of a proposition, even in those things which do not have being, as we say that blindness is, because it is true that a man is blind. Therefore, when Damascene says that the being of God is manifest to us, it is taken in the second way, and not the first. For in the first way, the being of God is the same as his substance, and as his substance is unknown, so is his being. But in the second way, we say that God exists, because we conceive this proposition in our intellect from his effects. Being is said in 2 ways. In one way it signifies the act of being. In another way, it signifies the composition of a proposition, which the soul invents by joining the predicate to the subject. Therefore, taking being in the first way, we cannot know the being of God, just as we cannot know his essence, but only in the second way. For we know that this proposition, which we form about God, when we say, God is true, and we know this from his effects, as was said above. St. Thomas is here answering an objection which declares that the being of God is not identical with his essence, because the essence of God is clearly manifested to us only in vision, whereas the existence of God is clearly manifested to us even here on earth. He answers that what is clearly manifested to us here below is the truth of the proposition. God is, which can be proved from creatures. In other words, this is the copulative being by which, constrained by the evidence of the proof, we join in our mind the predicate existing to the subject God. This being is different from the one which signifies the act of being, since we can say, blindness is, whereas blindness as such does not exercise the act of being. To say that blindness is in a man is only to affirm that a man is blind, to join the predicate blind to the subject man. On the contrary, the being signifying the act of being and attributed to God in this same proposition. God is, or God has being, exceeds our knowledge for the same reason as does the divine essence with which it is strictly identical. And, like this essence, it is known by analogy and by a defective mode of conceiving.
Such is clearly the meaning of these texts in St. Thomas. It is impossible to find that meaning in an interpretation like the following. In this proposition, God is, the verb to be, does not signify real being considered as an attribute. It is only the logical link in a true proposition, and is used in a sense which would be equally authentic in a thing without real existence, as when we say, blindness is. The author of the commentary from which these lines are taken seems here to forget that precisely when we say, blindness is, we affirm only the logical bond between a predicate, blind, and a subject, some man, because blindness is a being of reason, whereas in the case of God, who is not a being of reason, we affirm, in saying that he is, both this logical link and the perfection, act of being, attributed by means of this link to the subject of the proposition as a real being and all that is most real, known by analogy. The same is true of existence as is true of life, of goodness, of unity, etc. These are predicates which we attribute to God without thereby positing in God any composition of subject and attribute, for this composition belongs to the purely logical order and concerns only our thought. Such names are predicated of God substantially. Affirmative propositions can be truly formed about God. Although in God there is no quality or determination added to his substance, we can predicate these names of him in the concrete, according to a defective mode of signifying which of itself alludes to non-subsisting determinations. And although the manner of signifying is deficient, the name which by its very indetermination most eminently befits him, qui est, is the first of these names attributed to God in the proper sense, and as a perfection that is most real. I am who I am. Exodus 3:14. The revealed utterance itself attributes to God. I, by means of the verbal copula, am, existence, who am, as constituting its essence. If, in this proposition, God is, the verb to be, signified only the logical copula and not real being, attributed as a predicate by means of the copula, how could St. Thomas, in the same article of the De Potentia, attribute real being to God by affirming that God is being itself, and that the being of God is distinguished from every other being by the very fact that it is being in itself subsisting? He himself explicitly declares that the intellect attributes being to God. The intellect attributing being to God transcends the mode of signifying, attributing to God what is signified, but not the mode of signifying. And he is evidently not speaking of the being which belongs to the verbal copula when he writes, "What I call being is the actuality of all acts, and for this reason, it is the perfection of all perfections." Doubtless, in attributing being to God, we do attribute to him a name drawn by us from creatures, which are what we first know. But as the meaning of the word, being, like wisdom and goodness, is said of God before being said of his creatures. Thus, it is completely ambiguous to say, "He who is but the name of a creature." As to the things signified by the name, such names are said of God before being said of creatures, because such perfections flow from God into creatures. It is perfectly clear that God is not one of the beings which share common being. He is outside the order of beings. The divine will is to be understood as existing outside the order of beings, as a certain cause pouring forth all being and all its differences. But precisely because he is the cause of common being, which is the being common to the 10 categories and the subject of metaphysics, he is himself, in his perfect incommunicability, subsisting being itself. God is being itself, subsisting. Let us conclude that we should not say, purely and simply, we do not know what God is, but rather, we do not know what God is in himself. Nor should we say purely and simply, we know what God is, but rather, we know imperfectly what God is, without being able to grasp his essence in itself. It was with much reluctance that we have had to criticize certain expressions of Father Sertalanges here. It was not our intention to accuse him of semi-agnosticism, as Father Romeyer did, in so serious a matter, wherein incorrect expressions may so easily obscure correct thought. Such an accusation should not be hastily brought against so well-informed a philosopher. Father Sertalanges has an acute sense of the transcendence of pure act, but the vocabulary he uses in order to bring out this transcendence, and which he borrows either from a language less developed and less scientific than that of St. Thomas, or from technical expressions of St. Thomas which lose their exact meaning in translation, is apt to lead to serious misunderstandings. Ambiguity is not a philosophical instrument, and the conciliation of Thomism with certain modern systems would be too dearly paid for were it to be bought at the price of equivocal language.